My name is Mike Morris. I'm with the Merrimack Storm Surge, Merrimack Valley Coastal Adaptation Work Group, and we're sponsoring this program tonight. And this is the last of our spring series programs. And we're a very young organization, and what I wanted to do before I introduce Jim O'Connell, our speaker tonight, is just kind of go quickly through what we've done in the last 9 months, because a lot has happened. And so let me move on. So, Storm Surge basically originated or came together back in September. People got together and started talking about it following the winter storm season of 2013 and all the erosion and houses falling in the ocean that we had on Plum Island. So we officially launched in September, and we decided that we wanted to help our communities adapt to sea level rise and address climate change. And climate change is sort of the overarching issue here, and but what's real for us down here on the coast is sea level rise and increased storm activity. So we're basically, our strategy is to get people to think about sea level rise adaptation and adapting to storm surge, but also keep in mind that we need to address this whole climate change issue because that's what's driving all of this. Our organization basically consists of a steering committee, and we thought it would have these other spokes. Community outreach is one of our bigger groups. They're the group that puts on all these programs. And we have a bunch of people with some science background that would help contribute. But we are looking to develop areas in finance, for example, grant writing and those sorts of activities and fundraising. And we haven't really defined how we're going to handle the whole government part of that, but there are members in the steering committee and community outreach working with local elected officials to think about what they're going to do about our rising oceans and how that's going to impact our communities. We're a nonprofit organization, and we've received some grant monies from the Institution for Savings and the New England Grassroots Fund, and we thank them for their support. One of our big strategies in terms of education is to keep a presence going in the newspapers. And so we have people writing articles, doing things that keep the message out there before the public. And one thing that we've noticed is that elected officials read newspapers, and as we start generating press, they start coming to our programs and they start thinking about what's going on and what they need to do for their communities. So with really a shoestring budget or no budget, we put together a really good group of speakers that were experts on the topics back in the fall. And then in the middle of winter, we put on a program that we put it together with Rob Thompson, who's the meteorologist in charge at the National Weather Service in Taunton, and we came up with a sort of a bad case storm scenario for this area, and we involved emergency management officials in this. And the idea of this program was to get people thinking about, okay, what are we going to do if something like this happens? And what's the likelihood that something like this might happen in a warming climate? And then this spring we've had Wendy Goldsmith, the film Short Up. Kirk Bosma was here a few weeks back, and then Anna Maria Frankich with the oysters. So how have we done in the last 9 months? So about 740 people have come through our programs since we started, and we're hoping that after tonight we might hit the 800 mark or more. Our mail list has grown to 269, and we have an active Facebook page where people are posting every day, and there's a discussion going on there. And what I don't have on here is that we've also got a YouTube channel where if you want to see a program that maybe you missed, you can go on that and watch a past program, because they're all there. We've got elected officials attending our programs, which I mentioned before, and climate change is becoming part of Newburyport's master plan. And our meeting with the mayor we had a few weeks back, she indicated that doing a vulnerability assessment for the city was a major priority, and they're trying to figure out how that's going to happen. So we like to think that we've effected some change here. This is just the Facebook page, that's the YouTube channel. And so what are we thinking about doing in the upcoming year and in the future? We're still going to continue our presence in the papers and in the press and on the Facebook page. We want to expand our website content. We're going to develop another speaker series for the fall, and we also have an event, or at least a date slotted for an event at the firehouse, which we haven't fully defined or fleshed out yet, but it's going to be on October 29th, so keep your ears open for that. We're trying to see if we can obtain a seat on the Massachusetts Coastal Erosion Commission, and we're trying to also put together a program for municipal planners to educate them on sea level rise and climate change. And we're also in conversations with the National Weather Service about exploring the development of a splashover model for Plum Island and Salisbury beaches like they've done for Situate and another community in Maine. But these all require funds, and so fundraising and grant writing and that sort of thing is something that we also need to expand on. We're also trying to get programs going for the local schools and other organizations like Audubon, for example. And we're working with the Newburyport Art Association and local artists to implement a community-wide sculpture exhibit with climate change and sea level rise being the theme. And then we'll continue to interact with other groups in this field, sort of doing the same thing that we're doing. You may have seen that there's a volunteer survey out there. We're looking for people to help out. If you think this is a great cause and an issue that we need to address, we certainly could use the help. And if you can't volunteer, but if you can afford $1, there's a fishbowl out front. We'll take donations.
Mike, you got a mic. Mike, you got a mic.
Oh, I got a mic. Okay. Okay. But right now, what I'd like to... Is it on? Okay. So one of the consequences of our success is that our programs have gotten big enough, and our attendance, especially in the earlier programs this year, exceeded our capacity at the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, where we've held most of our programs. But we want to show our appreciation and thanks to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the refuge for hosting us, because we were probably a little bit difficult. We stayed longer than we were supposed to, and never really got started on time, and then we had some technical issues because we didn't know how to run the equipment. But anyway, what I have here is a plaque, letter of thanks for Frank Drzezinski, who's not here tonight, but I believe Francis Rodriguez is here in his place to accept this. And we also have a... So the Wildlife Refuge has been very helpful to us and very supportive, and we were never charged anything, and it was a great accommodation, and we really appreciate all your help with that.
It was a pleasure always, and we're always there to help whenever we can.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So moving on to tonight's program. I always marvel at man's audacity to try to control everything on the planet in terms of regulating man's environment to basically fit his needs. And one of those is specifically water. And here's an example of a river that's been totally managed for agricultural irrigation. And then, of course, we have all the various tiered structures for the rice paddies. And then some really extravagant flood-controlled and hydroelectrical dams. I mean, these are huge projects and huge efforts and huge ambitions, and they are successful in what they do. And these images are from a film called Watermark, which is airing at the Portsmouth Music Hall on July 5th and 8th, if you want to see that more. It's about man's relationship with water. It's sort of a love-hate relationship, and it's worth seeing. But, one of the things that we would probably like to do that we can't do is control the weather, although we are, in fact, sort of directing it through climate change now. So we're warming our oceans, we're melting our polar ice caps, and as a result, our sea levels are rising, and we're fueling intense storms. And we've got oceans that have got a lot of heat energy to motivate all these processes. So if we go back to the fossil record, and you may have heard me state this before, but if we look at the heat we've got in the atmosphere now, the carbon content, and we look at what sea level was back then, because all of those variables sort of follow each other, we had 21 extra feet of water back in those days. So basically an order already has been set for an additional 21 feet of water. We just haven't melted the ice yet, and we're trying to figure out how fast this water is going to arrive. Now everybody has seen this graph here before, and there are various projections out there depending on what our emission scenario is, but I like to flip this around the other way because I think it has more impact, and then we get a boat of clowns up there, and that's really where we're going if we don't start to address all this. There's a steep change in the curve, and it's sort of like going over a waterfall. Once you go past that tipping point, it really starts to unravel and starts to get away from you. So we still have a certain amount of denial that this is really happening, and I think people along the coast understand that something's happening, and we're here to educate people about the reality of what's happening, because we need to wake up, and especially as communities, if we hope to protect our infrastructure, or if we have to give it up, we need to figure out what are we going to do without some of those things. So when you look at ground level, you sort of you don't see the forest for the trees. So here we have Plum Island. We had a knee-jerk reaction to a devastating storm back in March of 2013, and we just brought all the rocks we could find wherever they could come from and just started building a wall without really any design or thought to what impact this wall might have. But if you're, for example, an Army type person or a general, you really want to understand what the enemy is all about. And at ground level here, you don't really understand the foe that you're trying to contain here. But if you start going up a little bit higher into the atmosphere, and you start looking down as to where you are, you can start to see that that little area with all those rocks is really pretty tiny. And this wall that you're building, you're trying to hold back this monster out there. And you know, do you really think that we can build a wall that's going to contain that mass of water? And especially when you slosh a storm like this through an ocean like that. So leading into tonight's program, are there any erosion control measures that really work, or are we just really kind of wasting our time? And this guy here, I think, is going to tell us what we can do and what works and what doesn't. I'll give you the floor. Jim?
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is I'm a post-glacial geologist. I've been doing coastal geology work in Massachusetts, up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and around the country for about 30 years now. I started out working with the State Coastal Zone Management Office for 13 years. I went to the Cape Cod Commission for a year. Went to the Oceanographic Institution Seabird program for 10 years. And then, with the Seabird program, I was allowed to go to one national conference per year. So that year I decided to go to the North Shore of Hawaii to talk about Duxbury Beach and how we manage Duxbury Beach. And 3 months later, I was on a plane flying to the island of Kauai because I was offered a job while I was at that conference with the Sea Grant program with the University of Hawaii. So I spent the next 2 years on the island of Kauai working with the county government and anybody else who would listen to what I have to say about coastal erosion control, shoreline development, sea level rise, coastal processes, and so forth. And before I left, I had 7 kayaks. And I had spear fishing gear, scuba diving gear, and I sold everything except my house because I was never coming back. But Kauai is 25 miles long and 30 miles wide. And I brought my 2 children with me who were in their early 20s. In the first year, they had a blast. They were surfing and skateboarding, and then the island started to shrink. And my son said, I miss my girlfriend. And my daughter said, I wish I could go shopping in a big mall somewhere. So they left. A year later, Mom says, the kids are pretty far away. What do you think? I said, no, I don't want to go back. So I came back for that 5-letter word, family. But boy, it was quite an experience living on an island for 2 years. So I came back, and after I got over my depression for about a year, I became the conservation agent in the town of Scituate, arguably one of the most hazard-prone coastal communities in terms of northeast storms in Massachusetts, if not on the Atlantic seaboard. Except now by realizing that Plum Island is running a solid second, or maybe even tied for the town of Scituate. And I got offered a job by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but not updating its flood insurance rate maps. What I did was I went out and did field assessments after Hurricane Sandy and the blizzard Nemo in February. And we visited almost every community in Massachusetts and Rhode Island looking at the damages that were caused and why. You know, and that teaches you an awful lot when you're looking at what happened, why did the house next door survive and this one didn't. So it's quite an experience. But when the disaster field office closes, then you're out of a job. So I started my own little consulting practice. So now I've worked for the feds, I've worked for the state, I've worked for the county, I've worked for the locals, I've worked for a scientific university and an education university, and now I have to go out and tell the homeowners I've worked with all the stuff that I helped develop. And I was like, who made up this stuff anyway? You mean I can't build a seawall in front of my house? Who made up these rules? So I have to kind of put my head down and say, well, I helped. And say, let's see what we can do. So it's been quite an experience. So I think I have a pretty good perspective in terms of coastal processes, erosion control, from all levels of government as well as now in the private sector. So what I want to do is I want to take you on a little tour now and just talk about the pros and cons of all the coastal erosion control alternatives that I ran into. There's a lot of experimental ones out there too that I may mention, I may not. But there's quite an array of coastal erosion control alternatives that are available. And after 30 years, I'm asking myself, does any of this really work? And I'm not going to answer the question. I'm going to ask you guys to answer the question after you see everything that I show you, because I'm going to show you the whole gamut of what's available to people and what they have actually done in a case history. Does anybody recognize that image that's in the background there? Can anybody take a guess of what that may be? Looks like a barnacle. Well, it's actually a sand shoal that's subaqueous. It's in a very shallow water. It's in Cape Cod Bay. It's called Billingsgate Shoal. It was once an island. It had 30 houses on it, a schoolhouse. It had a lighthouse. This was an island that was a thriving fishing community up until 1942, when it finally submerged. Some of the houses that were on there were floated across Cape Cod Bay, and they're actually on the bluffs in the town of Eastham now. So the reason I'm showing you this is because the reason why that island disappeared was because there was a change in the sand transport system. In other words, sand was coming from that island routinely. If you look down here, here's Cape Cod Bay. This is Cape Cod. Here's Cape Cod Bay. There's Provincetown, Chatham down here. The island was just off Jeremy Point in Wellfleet in this location here. So the sand transport system, sand was coming when we got our northwest winds and our north winds. The sand was coming down. It was hitting these coastal banks, these coastal bluffs, and it was providing an enormous amount of sand, which was traveling south and feeding this island. Well, as Provincetown continued to grow in sand, so in other words, here's the Cape Cod National Seashore. When we have our northeast storms, the northeast storm waves come down, they hit the Cape Cod National Seashore banks, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. Some of that sand was coming up around, and that's what formed Provincetown. Provincetown is all sand. It's all sand from the erosion of the Cape Cod National Seashore bluffs. Well, as Provincetown, this hook continued to grow, it changed the whole transport system of sand. So there was very little sand going to Billingsgate Island, and it started to shrink, and then in the 1940s it finally submerged. So coastal erosion control, really, it's all about sediment movement. It's all about sediment and sand movement, particularly controlling sediment or attempting to control sand movement. That was just one radical example. Now, when I meet with the client or with the community, I will go out and they'll say, you know, what can we do in this particular area to help protect my property, protect my investment, my home, or whatever it may be. So knowing what's available, knowing all the erosion control alternatives, we know what they are. The engineers know what they are. Geologists know what they are. You know, we've got riprap revetments, bulkheads, gabion revetments, fiber rolls, dune restoration, beach nourishment. We've got the whole gamut. And this was just a list that I made of a lot of the coastal erosion control alternatives that are available to us today. And we break them down into two categories, structural and non-structural. Structural are the hard ones, the seawalls, the revetments, the bulkheads, the things that have real substance to them. Groins, breakwaters, dikes and jetties. Those are the structural erosion control alternatives. Then we have a list of non-structural erosion control alternatives, such as beach nourishment, dune restoration, salt marsh building, snow fencing, things of that nature, groundwater discharge, things of that nature. So we break them up into two categories, but knowing the gamut of what's available is the easy part. The hard part is trying to select the correct one for that particular location. So choosing the successful alternative or what may work on that particular site is the easy part. But we know we can't stop erosion. We can slow it for a period of time, and you have to accept that fact. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to balance a number of goals. When I'm on a site, I'm trying to balance a number of goals to come up with the right alternative for that particular site. So we want to make sure that there's infrequent maintenance. We want to make sure that there's no adverse impacts to the beneficial function of the landform, which I'll explain in a minute. We don't want to interfere with the public trust rights of fish fouling and navigating along the beach or public access. The benefit-cost ratio has to work out. It has to be cost-effective, or if somebody's not going to invest in it. The environmental gains and losses, aesthetics, societal impacts, and the ecological services, the gains and the losses in the ecology. We've got to balance all of these things to come up with the right alternative. So when you're looking at a coastal erosion control alternative, you've got to break it down into structural and non-structural, particularly what environment are you in? Are you in a high-wave energy environment, high-wave open ocean environment? Are you in a little quiescent bay, in the backwaters of a bay, on a estuarine, or where alternatives that wouldn't work on the open shore may? So we've got to break these down and look at the wave climate and the sediment transport volumes before you can come up with an alternative. So in order to select the right one, you have to have an understanding of coastal processes, that interaction between waves and tides, currents, sand volume, sediment transport, and human activity. So I'm going to explain a little bit about these processes. So we've got to understand, if you can understand where a coastal landform came from, how it formed, how it's evolving, then you can understand what the causes of the erosion may be on that site. And that's what we're looking for, what's causing the erosion. So when we're looking at coastal processes, there's really four fundamental principles that you need to understand. And one is, in the New England region, the primary source of sand, pebble, and cobble that created the beaches, the dunes, and the barrier beaches that you see today comes from the erosion of glacial uplands, of glacial deposited sediments. That's the fundamental principle. The primary source that formed and allows for the continued existence of beaches, dunes, and barrier beaches, and all the estuarine organisms that live behind some of these barrier beaches, comes from the erosion of glacial sediments, glacial lands, number one. Now, the composition of your beach is really going to depend on what type of glacial landform is eroding. If you have a moraine deposit, for example, you're going to end up with a boulder cobble beach. And here's a barrier beach up here. So these would be coarse-grained sediments because they're in very close proximity to this moraine. This is the Buzzards Bay moraine. So the type of landform that's eroding and supplying that sediment is going to dictate the type of beach you have. That was the moraine deposit. You saw the boulders and the pebble and the cobble on that beach. Now, if we go to glacial outwash, for example, the eastern shore of Nantucket, the southern part of Plymouth, the Cape Cod National Seashore, these are glacial outwash plains. They're very coarse-grained materials. They were washed out from the glacier and sorted, and the boulders drop first, and then the cobble, and then the sandy deposit. These are outwash plains. So outwash plains are going to give you beautiful, coarse-grained, sandy beaches. The second fundamental principle is longshore sediment transport. So the material erodes from these glacial landforms. The material moves in some direction, and it moves in the opposite direction that the waves are coming from. Just as an example, if I had a ball in my hand and I threw it at that wall at an angle, it's going to end up going in that direction. Well, that's precisely what waves do. Waves will move the sediment, the pebble, the cobble, and the sand. So, for example, the waves are hitting the shore from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, so it's setting up a longshore current. And in that current is the sediment. The pebble, the cobble, the sand is moving from left to right in this particular location. So now you've got longshore sediment transport. As a radical example, here's Cape Cod here, and I'll be moving to the North Shore in a minute. But here's Cape Cod. This is a really radical example of that erosion from the glacial upland and longshore sediment transport. This is the black line is what Cape Cod looked like before sea level rise reached its present point and started to erode those landforms. So you can see it has a very smooth shape all around Cape. Well, it didn't have that shape until sea level rose and started to erode and transport that material. All of Provincetown came from this land here, which was 4 miles out from the Cape Cod National Seashore when it was first laid down. 4 miles of the Cape Cod National Seashore have actually eroded and provided the sand that now forms all of Provincetown. Provincetown sits on sandy deposits and all these other barrier beaches. The next principle is basically, with the longshore sediment transport, the wind now will pick up the finer grain material, blow it landward until it hits something, a blade of grass, a snow fence. The wind velocity slows and the sand drops, and then the dunes will start to form. And the fourth principle is the on and offshore movement, seasonally and during storms. Now, seasonally, this to me is like a symphony. So you've got a beautiful, wide, sandy beach in the summertime, and you go there in the wintertime, and it's a very narrow beach, and the sandbars are offshore, tripping the storm waves. And then when the springtime comes, the shape of the wave changes, and it's the shape that moves the sediment. The shape of the wave, storm waves, change in the spring. It becomes more gentle, less steep, and it moves that sand landward, and it wells onto the beach. And this symphony has been going on forever, and it goes on around the world on every beach. So you've got those four primary principles. And one of the quintessential examples of bringing all these together is here in this little area here. This is the Cape Cod National Seashore in the town of Truro. Now, during a storm, that coastal dune will break through. But because of the erosion of the Cape Cod National Seashore banks, the longshore sediment transport, the wind picking up the sand and blowing it up, it reforms every single time after every single storm. It's an uninterrupted consolidation of those four principal coastal processes. So in a natural state left alone, what we've got is basically a self-sustaining system. Erosion and accretion, erosion and accretion. Storm waves break through dunes. They'll reform in a self-sustaining system. Now we're going to throw human activity into the equation and see what we do, see how we interfere with these natural coastal processes, and see if we can still obtain a self-sustaining system in some way. So basically, what we're talking about, this is a barrier beach that's 7 miles long, much like Plum Island, and it started out this light-colored sand. This is sand here. So what it did was, as the erosion of the bluffs up here, longshore sediment transport, it kept adding to it, and finally it got to a point where the salt marsh could start to form. Salt marsh can only form in a quiescent environment. It won't form in a wave environment because the plants can't take root. So then we end up with salt marshes, and we end up with intertidal habitat, shorebird habitat, shellfish habitat, and so forth. So this basically just is another example of those four processes coming together to form all the resources that we see today. This is Nantasket Beach in Hull. It's another about 8 mile long barrier beach on the south shore. You can see it's densely developed. And how this formed was a series of drumlins, glacial drumlins, like Barhead Drumlin at the south end of Plum Island. That's a glacial drumlin. Well, there were a series of drumlins here in this location. Before sea level rise reached these drumlins, they were laid down at the base of the glacier, underneath the glacier. So all these drumlins were just sitting there until sea level rose, got to a point, started to erode the drumlins, and started to form these little sand sheets, these little barriers connecting the drumlins. And the more the sea level rose, the more erosion took place of these glacial uplands, and we ended up with this beautiful barrier beach here, which is densely developed. So that's the fundamental principle on how barrier beaches form. But that's the first model. Now we'll throw in Plum Island and Salisbury. This is a different model, but it still has the same processes working on it. It's just a different way of how it happened. So here we have, you know, Salisbury and Plum Island quite well. Here it is here. So I'm going to talk about how Salisbury and Plum Island evolved. Now you saw how most of the barrier beaches in Massachusetts formed through the erosion of glacial uplands, glacial landforms, erosion, longshore sediment transport, deposition, wind blowing it, so forth. So now we're going to look at Plum Island. Now back when sea level was about 300 to 350 feet lower, this is what the shoreline pretty much looked like. There were no beaches. There were no beaches. There were no dunes. There were no barrier beaches. Sea level was miles offshore. It was George's Bank. You could walk out to George's Bank. It was a dry connection because sea level was so low. All the water was captured up in the glaciers, and obviously this is what it looks like today. So let's look and talk a little bit about how Plum Island and Salisbury formed. Now, when I was putting together this talk, I have scientific research on how Plum Island and Salisbury formed, and I was just perusing the internet looking for any new scientific research that had been done in this particular region, and I found this poster, this model that was just published last year in 2013 by the Massachusetts Geologic Survey at the University of Massachusetts. So what I did was I took these beautiful color little layouts and I put them on each slide, and I want to run you through how Plum Island and Salisbury Beach formed, because it's pretty fascinating. So we know that 20 to 23,000 years ago, we know the glacier, the last continental glacier, reached its maximum. It reached as far as Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Long Island. So it reached that far. So this area was completely covered in ice, about a mile thick ice. The weight of that ice depressed this land considerably. And I'll tell you a little bit about what happened. But you can see here's Massachusetts. Here's the most southern extent of the last continental glaciation. So what I did was, on each one of these frames, I took this information here and I broke it down into just a couple of sentences to try to simplify it for you. So bear with me while I read it. But I simplified this here. So now I want you to look closely here. You see this arrow here? Can you see that there? It shows up much better on my screen here. This is modern day Plum Island, right here. Okay, you can see that in the background here. So when sea level was here, it depressed the land so much that when the glaciers receded, the land had not had enough time to rebound. So the sea level was actually about 33 meters higher than it is today. So take your high tide line and go up 33 meters. It was because the land was depressed that water moved inland and covered wherever you could take the 33-meter line and move it inland. That's where sea level was about 17,000 years ago. So this area was completely covered by the sea. So again, keep in mind, this is where modern-day Plum Island was. That's where the shoreline was at that time. So if you move inland and you're doing a perk test for a septic system or something, you're going to run into little deltas and little barrier beaches and beaches beneath the cover of soil that's over there right now. So then what happened was, over time, between 17,000 and 14,000 years ago, the land actually popped up. And the sea level, the relative sea level, actually migrated much farther seaward now. But about now, think of this. So that was 17,000 years ago. 14,000 years ago, sea level was 45 meters lower than it was today. So now take the sea, where it is today, think about 45 meters lower, move that shoreline out. That's because so what's happening to the land is not static. The land is isostatically rebounding and sinking. So now it was depressed, now it rose, and the sea level moved seaward. So what happened was now you've got the Parker River, the Merrimack River, the Parker River, and the Rowley River depositing their sand and their silt and their sediment miles offshore, several miles offshore, forming a delta. So your Plum Island is somewhere in here. So this is what's happening. There's a massive delta forming now because the Merrimack River is emptying all of its sediment that far out, miles offshore. And then sea level began to rise again. So as sea level rose, so here's where pretty much where modern day Plum Island is now. So as the sea level continued to rise, that delta that you just saw that was several miles offshore, as sea level hit that delta, this was all, this was all beautiful sandy, silty deposits. It started to move that delta landward, and it started to move it and move it into different sand sheets. So you've got this massive sand delta. Sea level starts to rise. It starts to overtake the delta, and it starts to spread out the delta into these sand sheets. And that's what you see, the beginning of the formation of Salisbury and Plum Island here. So now sea level has moved in. It has inundated the backside. Here's the sand sheets from that delta here. And as those sand sheets start to spread from that longshore sediment transport process, it's breaking the waves down. The salt marsh is just starting to form. The intertidal areas are just starting to form. That was about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago when sea level started to slow. And as sea level started to slow, that's when that sand started to coalesce. And there's the beginning of your migrating of your barrier beach. So here we go, here we are here. The barrier beach, sea level starts to slow. The barrier beach and all the sand deposits start to slow in their migration landward. They stop in place and they start to spread out. There's your modern day Plum Island and Salisbury Beach beginning to form in your Castle Neck. Here's Merrimack River. There's the Parker River forming out here. And this is what you ended up with. So it all ended up with, it was a result of the glacial depression and rebound. So rather than your sand deposits coming from the glacial erosion of glacial landforms like we see mostly in the northeast region, the sediments for Plum Island and Salisbury actually come from that beautiful delta that forms several miles offshore. So the delta forms those barriers. There's not a lot of sand left in that delta to feed these barriers anymore. It's one of the reasons why you're seeing the erosion rates you're seeing. So that was something I threw in at the last minute after I had my whole talk together, because after I ran into that, I thought it was pretty fascinating. So what happened? So then, right here was where the Parker River used to exit out. So that longshore sediment transport finally overtook the Parker River and closed it up. 60% of Plum Island, of the southern part of Plum Island, was formed by longshore sediment transport. And that's what they're trying to show you here. These little spits at the end here grew and grew and grew and grew. So once the Parker River tidal inlet closed up, longshore sediment transport made the southern part of Plum Island. 60% of Plum Island came from that longshore sediment transport process. And this was basically, this is the model that I had until I found that little diagram from the University of Massachusetts. So your erosion rates now, the erosion rates now on Plum Island are accelerating somewhat. That's primarily because of sea level rise and because the sediment, the source sediment in that delta deposit is basically diminishing. It's drying up. It's already formed the barrier. Now you've got basically significant shoreline taking place. The same thing happened with Duxbury Beach on the South Shore. Oh, that's much better. You're right on top of it. Oh, much better. I have a pointer and I'm I hear you. All right. So the same thing happened in Duxbury Beach on the South Shore. I'm on the board of directors of the Duxbury Beach Reservation, and it's a 4.5-mile barrier beach that's owned by this nonprofit organization in trust. And this was the barrier beach, just like Plum Island and Salisbury. The Duxbury barrier beach formed in a similar way from drumlins and erosions of glacial uplands, and it has migrated landward between a half mile and a mile since it was formed about 4,500 years ago. So it's actually migrated landward about almost close to a mile. So once we have this barrier beach, everything behind here, basically, the salt marshes, the intertidal flats, the bird habitat, the shellfish beds, and so forth, owe their existence to erosion of glacial uplands, to erosion of these former glacial deltas. All of these resources owe their existence to erosion, ironically. So let's get into a little bit about some of these coastal erosion control alternatives. So here we have a coastal bank. Okay, if you own one of these houses, your house is in jeopardy of erosion. This is the eastern shore of Nantucket. This is a real situation here. So this is a coastal bank. It's a sediment source to what? To all the beaches and the barrier beaches downdrift. All the properties downdrift get the erosion from the sediment that's coming out of this coastal bank. Or let's take a look at a coastal dune. It's the same thing. You're in jeopardy of loss of your property due to coastal erosion. You've got three basic choices. You can either do nothing, walk away, probably not a choice you're going to choose. You could relocate or demolish. Well, to relocate or demolish, if it's your primary residence and it's your investment, I'm not sure. On Nantucket, 7 houses have been moved landward. There's no more lots left. They're not sure what they're going to do at this point. So let's take a coastal bank, or a coastal dune for that matter, and take a look at what the alternatives are. So again, I'm coming back to knowing what the alternatives are is the easy part. You can list them all. It's trying to decide which one is best for that particular location. So this is what we're trying to do. So we've got a property owner, okay? They want to maximize the use of their property. They want to keep their property nice looking, aesthetics to maximize the value of the property. You've got to, so that's the property owner. The consultants, we need to satisfy the client. We need to make a profit, maintain credibility, and have a successful design. Is it going to work? Is it going to be successful? And we need to go before the regulators who are in charge of enforcing the regulations. And they're also resource stewards. So what we've got to do what we've got to understand really is you can pick an alternative. It can be cost effective. You know it will work. But now you've got to make sure it's compliant with the regulations, because if it's not, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your client's time, and you're wasting money. So you've got to have an understanding of the regulations. So I just want to talk a little bit about what the constraints are in the regulations for coastal banks and coastal dunes. So for coastal banks, it's a sediment source, obviously, to downdrift beaches, barrier beaches and dunes and so forth. And it's also a vertical buffer. A vertical buffer coastal bank is one that's densely vegetated. So the interests are storm damage prevention and flood control, and the regulatory standard is no adverse impact. How can you do something to any resource and have no adverse impact? In any event, so the critical characteristic which the regulations are trying to preserve is its ability to erode and provide that sediment. Because we know once you chop that sediment off, you know what's going to happen to the downdrift beaches and barrier beaches and dunes and so forth. So the regulations, this is what the regulations say for coastal banks. No new bulkhead, revetment, or seawall can be built on a coastal bank, on a sediment source coastal bank, that provides sediment to beaches, dunes, and barrier beaches, except to protect a building. Now that word is in the regulations, except to protect a building that was built before August 10, 1978. That was the promulgation date of the regulations. So if you build your house after August 10, 1978, you cannot structurally armor your coastal bank, because the scientists came out with a report for the legislature and said that sediment is so important to other people's properties and their resources, you've got to stop coastal armoring of these banks. So they put a prohibition on armoring a sediment source coastal bank after August 10th of 1978. And many of the local communities have actually made that regulation more predictable and more stringent. For example, in the town of Orleans, they actually say no coastal engineering structure can be permitted if the building, even if you qualify for a revetment or a seawall, you can't build it until the building is less than 20 feet away from the edge of that coastal bank, because they recognize the importance of that sediment that's coming out of that particular coastal bank. The same thing with coastal dunes. Critical characteristics. This is what the regulations are trying to preserve. The critical characteristics of a coastal dune are its ability to erode and supply its sediment. Where? To beaches, other people's properties, and downdrift beaches. You can't change the dune volume or the dune form or destroy its vegetative cover. So it can provide storm damage prevention and flood control if its volume is adequate, if it's densely vegetated. So that's basically what the regulations say. You can't change the ability to erode, and you can't change its dune form or volume or vegetative cover or its ability to migrate landward. In other words, it's a moving system. The interest, storm damage prevention, flood control, and wildlife habitat. The performance standard is no adverse impact. So let's talk a little bit. I wanted to just give you some of the constraints that we're all up against as property owners or consultants when we're looking at trying to preserve property on a coastal dune or a coastal bank. Let's look at some of the pros and cons, the pros and cons of some of these erosion control structures. And let's start with the structural measures. Okay? So structural armoring, seawalls, revetments, bulkheads, groins, dikes, and so forth. Benefits, they stabilize the upland. They'll maximize your property value and protect infrastructure. And that could be on a coastal bank or a coastal dune. So it will stabilize the upland, maintain your property value, and protect your infrastructure. The detriments are what I just explained about coastal processes and landform function. You're going to have a source of sediment loss. The erosion of the frontal beach and downdrift beaches will accelerate. Direct loss of the resource by placement of the structure on the coastal beach itself. The ecological value will change. In some cases, if it's an erosional shoreline, eventually that water is going to catch up to the structure and you're going to lose access. could be a swimming hazard, and adjacent property impacts. You're going to increase the downdrift erosion because you've cut off the sediment supply. This is the neighborhood I live in. I live in Brant Rock, a little seaside section in the town of Marshfield. So, and I'm a collector of old postcards. I like to find old postcards that are date stamped of the shoreline. And I try to find where it was taken and get into the same location 100 years later and take the picture then, just to see what the comparisons are. So I've got a number of them, and this is one of them here. So this is the Brant Rock Public Beach, right at the turn of the century, the early 1900s. But to protect the road, landward of that, it's a state road. There was a seawall built. It was built and then rebuilt and reconstructed, and this is what it looks like today at high tide. There is no beach there, but it did protect the roadway, the highway, basically, that's just landward out of the picture. So again, what are our gains? This here is also in the town of Marshfield, a little north of where we just were. Beautiful sandy beach, a vegetated bank, sea levels rising. Sea levels continue to rise, storms and erosion. These houses were all threatened, so there was a series of revetments that were built. So within 100 years, what's the gain? Again, you're protecting valuable upland property. You have a habitat change, you get financial security of the first house anyway, and I'm not sure about the community gain. In the Heinz Center report that came out of Washington about a decade ago, the first value gains value in its property, but once the shoreline migrates and hits that structure, the value of the back property starts to diminish. That's just documented in the Heinz Center report. So basically, what you're losing is your coastal beach, the natural protection, but now you do have artificial protection for the upland area. You've lost your access, you've lost your recreation, and you've changed the habitat. That may be good or may be bad. There was a sandy habitat before, now we've got a rocky intertidal shore habitat. So here's an area here on the Cape. This whole area here was revetted, basically to save this valuable upland property, but it was revetted. You can see the Barrier Beach down here. The Barrier Beach used to come right off the end of this landform, but because of the loss of sediment, its migration rate has significantly accelerated, and it's overtaking the marsh, overtaking the resources. But the Barrier Beach itself has accelerated significantly in its migration, primarily because it lost its source of sand. We're looking at groins. This is Indian Neck in the town of Wellfleet here. We're looking at groins. Now groins are built for the specific purpose to trap sand to build a beach. A jetty is built at a harbor or an entrance to an estuary to keep sand out of the channel. So these series of groins. But if you look at the downdrift side, here's the sediment flow trapped by that beautiful beach on the updrift side. But if you look at the downdrift side of all these groins, what do you see? You see revetments and seawalls because you've cut off the sediment supply, basically on the immediate downdrift side of this groin. But again, the dilemma is they're protecting the valuable upland property updrift of that groin. Same thing here. Revetment was built here, got this beautiful sandy beach here, but the revetment has basically cut off the sediment supply. But there's several $1 million, if not billions of dollars of real estate that was saved as well. There's some balance, I think, that's attempting to be achieved here. This was an interesting. This revetment was built with the condition that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife property that's just around the corner, this was the access along that beach to the Fish and Wildlife property. So there was a condition put on this property when they built the revetment. You need to keep a 7 to 10 foot wide sandy strip in front of the revetment to allow access to that Fish and Wildlife property. Well, within 5 years, it was absolutely impossible to keep that sandy beach there. So the condition was basically eliminated, and now you walk along an asphalt road to get to the Fish and Wildlife property. But it was an attempt. Here's Plymouth Long Beach. It protects the downtown historic Plymouth waterfront. This is Long Beach, this Barrier Beach. The Portland gale of 1898 devastated that barrier, and there was a concern about the historic waterfront in Plymouth. If that Barrier Beach disintegrated, the historic waterfront in Plymouth would have been devastated. So the Corps of Engineers built this riprap dike down the center of the Barrier Beach. Now, because the Barrier Beach is migrating landward, which all Barrier Beaches are pretty much doing, and migrating landward or eroding on the front side till they get to a point where they're narrow and overwash reaches the other side, then it starts to accelerate its migration. So this Barrier Beach basically migrated landward. The dike is now exposed. The dunes can't be rebuilt anymore because the sand can't get up over the dike. So the dike continues along there, and then it disappears into the Barrier Beach. So there's a proposal now to rebuild the dike, make it larger, put stone aprons, but cover it with sand and keep it covered with sand so that the recreational and the environmental benefits will be reestablished. But the barrier beach is continuing its migration landward. This is Nantasket Beach, one of the most heavily used public beaches on the South Shore here. At one time, there was a beautiful wide sandy beach at that beach at one time. But sea levels rising, erosion, and they've pretty much lost it. And they're trying to attempt to keep that wall there at great public expense, but they've basically lost the beach. At the present time, they're looking for offshore sand sources to be able to rebuild the beach. I went to the, the Coastal Erosion Commission that was formed recently by the legislature. They're having public meetings now. I went to two of them, one on the Cape and one just Monday night in my community in Massachusetts. And at both of those meetings, several of the audience said, can we locate offshore sand sources so that we can feed these beaches? Sea levels rising, these are valuable waterfront properties, would rather do something that's more environmentally acceptable than trying to build a revetment or a seawall. We'd like to do beach nourishment, but there's no offshore sand sources available, and the inland sand sources are drying up in volume because they're used for the construction industry and they're used for small beach nourishment projects. So that was a repetitive comment that came up with the Coastal Commission to search for offshore sand sources to help not only the public beaches but private beaches. Let's see if we can find a more environmentally acceptable alternative to help preserve this valuable waterfront property and allow people to still have enjoyment of these beaches. One of the mitigation measures that's widely used in Massachusetts is calculating the volume of sand that used to come out of those coastal banks when you're building revetment and replace that sand over the revetment annually and let it go back into the system. So for those who qualify for revetments, I think that's a pretty nice balance. So they're causing an adverse impact by removing the sand, affecting their neighbor's property, affecting downdrift beaches, but the mitigation is to put that volume of sand over the revetment and let it be taken out naturally. It's an attempt to try to find a balance between allowing people to protect their valuable property and allow these resources to continue to exist. In low wave environments that are just periodically storm damaged, one of the practices is to build a revetment and then completely cover it. And so it'll still protect the valuable waterfront property, and it looks aesthetically nice. And under here is sand that will be released into the system and help the marsh to survive. So it's a pretty decent compromise. Marine mattresses. These are marine mattresses. They're gabion baskets. They look like loft. They're PVC-coated wire. Look like lobster pots, but they're much lower. They're only 4 to 6 inches wide. Well, this was an attempt to protect this waterfront property here, to put marine mattresses down and then to completely cover them with sand and vegetation. So when the storm comes, it's like the mitigation measure I just explained. The sand comes off the mattresses, feeds the beach, goes downdrift, and when the sand is removed from the marine mattresses, they're required to cover them again. Again, I think between the regulators and the private sector, we're trying to find a decent balance to allow protection and allow these resources to continue to exist. So these are the marine mattresses here. There was the coastal dune. There's been a lot of experimental erosion control projects that I've seen. I've seen some pretty crazy ones and some that actually may have promise. I've actually was involved with somebody saying that they could dig holes in the beach and pour this chemical into the beach, and this chemical would change the ionic bond of a quartz grain and actually so that they would attract each other. And he actually had a lot of people convinced to try to do it, and they did try to do it on the south side of Nantucket, but they got caught before they were allowed to. We still don't know what was in those buckets. But anyway, we've seen a lot of erosion control experiments attempted. And I think we ought to stay open-minded. Some of these may work. I'm not advocating anything like a bucket full of a chemical, but this was called the sand grabber. You can see some gabion revetments back there, but there's a number of these that have been tried over the years. This is called the sand saver. Now this actually accreted the beach, landward of it, but you can't get in the ocean. You have to climb over them. So, they can work in some locations and not in others. It depends on what your goal is in terms of waterfront protection, access, preserving a coastal resource. So this is the sand saver, which is called, if you go on their website, it's called a natural solution to beach accretion. And it did accrete the beach, but you can't get to the ocean. Breakwaters, we don't see a lot of breakwaters built anymore. These are the Five Sisters breakwaters off of Winthrop. And, breakwaters, I'd like, there was another one in the Erosion Commission. In fact, I even brought this up. I'd like to see some experiments done with offshore and nearshore breakwaters. Breakwaters will break up the wave energy, but you can only use them in an area where you have that longshore sediment transport. So as the sand moves down here, the waves hit the breakwater, and they create a quiescent environment landward of it, and it slows the longshore sediment transport process. But it doesn't stop it, it slows it, and you'll get a little salient, a little buildup of sand landward of it. So if you can artificially create that salient when you build a breakwater, and then let the system continue, the sand to move through the system, it may have some promise. You'll find a lot of them down off the Florida coast, and most other countries do use them. In this particular case, here's this Five Sisters breakwaters, and you can see that salient built up here. It built it up. But this is all seawall. Wrong. There's no sediment going through the system. So the breakwaters could possibly work, but there's no sand supply. So what they're doing now is a $17 million beach nourishment project to feed the sand up in this area here. Public project. This is in the town of Winthrop. So, breakwaters, I think, may have promise, but we need, I'd like to try some experiments in an area where no property would be damaged, and see if we can find that they work, because they don't stop the system. These are called T-head groins. When I was at FEMA, I worked with an engineer who was in Florida for a long time in his career, and he helped design these T-head groins. They're basically groins, but you've got rocks perpendicular on the outside of them, and then you do a beach nourishment project. It slows the movement of the beach nourishment in there, but you can see, this is all nourished sand. This looked like this. So it's not necessarily adversely affecting the downdrift side, because this sand is overtopping the groins, and it's still moving downdrift. So it has some promise, but if you don't keep up that beach nourishment and keep those groins cells filled to a trapping capacity, then it's no good, because then it's going to start adversely affecting the downdrift properties. So there's mitigation that's required that you have to follow up with, and somebody has to make sure that that follow-up mitigation is done. We've tried a lot. We've tried these geotextiles tubes, the long arc tubes, geotubes, sandbags, Durabags. We've tried them on a basis. Eastham allowed these extensively along properties that could have done riprap revetments. What they do is they're sand filled, then they cover them with sand, and they're required to keep them covered with sand. But if you have a series of storms like we had in 2012 and 2013, the sand is gone the first storm. And to get the sand back out there is very difficult. So bang, adverse impact to downdrift properties. They thought that you could maybe just slice those, let the sand out, and remove them. But they were deflated long before they deflated themselves. So that practice is kind of falling by the wayside, and it's only being used on emergency purposes. You'll see it a lot in North Carolina, South Carolina, New Jersey. Primarily, they'll put these geotubes, geotextile sand-filled tubes, primarily to protect public roads, while they try to think of an alternative to protect the road. So, sand-filled sea bags, same thing, on the eastern shore of Nantucket, they've tried terracing the coastal bank, and they've tried the coir envelopes down here, and it didn't last a winter. This eastern shore of Nantucket is wide open to the Atlantic Ocean, but they did try this extensive terracing of the coastal bank to try to hold the ocean back. It was unsuccessful. They've tried these coir envelopes, the coir envelopes. You've seen them here in Plum Island. In fact, the next picture is of Plum Island. They're coconut fiber wraps, basically, sand-filled wraps. They've got interstitial spaces. The sand is made to leach out of those coir envelopes very, very slowly. They're usually used on temporary. They're only going to last maybe, 1, 2, maybe 3, 4, or 5 years at most, and then the sand will deflate from them, and then it's got to be rebuilt. But they are being used usually on a temporary measure to help protect the property, while property owner trying to figure out what other alternative is available to them. This is the eastern shore of Nantucket. You can see the bottom row of the coir envelopes is already deflated. Once the bottom one gets deflated, the entire thing will collapse down. But again, this is a pretty high energy shore. You can see the coir wrap being laid out here. Basically, they put sand in it, roll it, tie it. They generally use 2 wraps. And the inside wrap usually has a smaller mesh to hold the sand inside for a longer period of time. So on the eastern shore of Nantucket, they've tried just about everything. They've tried a beach-face dewatering system. This was claimed to have worked on several beaches in Florida. The theory is this. There's massive PVC pipes put in a trench along the beach with holes in them. And then there's electric pumps connected to those. to electric pumps. So when the swash, wave swash comes up, there's sand in the wave swash. The sand doesn't just move in the near shore. A sand grain moves up the beach and down the beach. That's part of that longshore sediment transport process. So as the sand washes up with the swash, the pump turns on, sucks the seawater down, and the sand gets trapped in place. And then they've got discharge pipes every so often to discharge the water back there. And in Florida, they showed it was successful for a period of time. On Nantucket, it was successful for a period of time. It actually accreted the beach. So it accreted the beach, and it still allowed the sand system to move along. Everybody thought that was a pretty decent experiment to try. And then the pumps failed. And within a very, very short period of time, all the sand that had accreted eroded immediately. And so they turned the pumps on. They tried it several times, and they did it for about 15 years, and finally they just couldn't keep up with the electric pumps breaking down. The discharge pipes got damaged, and they finally abandoned the beach-based dewatering system. They've tried the terraces, they've tried the choir envelopes, they've filled in the bank and tried bank vegetation. They've tried drainage systems up on top. They've done the dune guard fencing, geotubes. And then they tried to do a beach nourishment project, and they found sand 2.5 miles offshore. It was a $20 million project that was proposed to last about 10 years. They found a sand source offshore. Well, the sand source offshore happened to be one of the recreational commercial fishing grounds. So that took care of that sand source, and there was no other sand source they could find. So opposition from the fishing industry, because it could have devastated the fishing industry, killed the beach nourishment project. So now these homeowners basically are just, well, actually, about a month ago, they did get an emergency certification to do 1,500 feet of a geotube. And then about 10 days ago, the Conservation Commission reversed and pulled the emergency certification out. What they're trying to do is they're trying to save these houses here. And I'm not sure in this particular high energy location what they're going to do. 7 houses relocated. There's no more land. Baxter Road, basically the public road that brings people to not just the waterfront properties, but the backside as well. The town of Nantucket is planning to relocate that road on the landward side of these other houses, at least to try to save that emergency access to the remaining houses. It's a very, very tough situation. And they also have a mile-long revetment that they're proposing now in front of these houses, that they will keep the sand covered over the revetment at all times. This is a high-energy shore. So that's under review and consideration now, a mile-long revetment. I happen to be retained by the downdrift property owners because they said, what if they don't maintain the sand cover over the revetment? What will happen to our properties? So I had to tell them. This is a picture, much like what's the house when you go to Plum Island, right at the center. Bennett Hill. When I read the book of Plum Island 20 years ago, the history of it, I looked at Bennett Hill, and I come up here periodically. One of my first research publications was on the Barhead Drumlin, back in the 1970s. But and I take a picture of that. And I used to show it in my lectures. Like, this is a 100-year-old house in a high-energy site, and it's still there. It's still surviving. Well, I went out today, and as well I did it a couple of times. But I used to get out and take pictures of this because I had a postcard in 1911. And this was what it looked like in 2003. Heavily vegetated, beautiful. But then those storms of 2012, 2013 devastated the coastal bank, and now they have a revetment. Again, concerned about protecting their valuable waterfront property. This is the town of Marshfield where I happen to live. And everybody comes up with the question, who pays for all this? Well, waterfront property owners and private property can pay for it. Who pays for all these? These seawalls were built in the 1930s and 40s with sand from the beach. So they're not only deteriorating from the outside from storm waves, they're deteriorating from the inside. They're well beyond their life expectancy. It costs about 4,000 linear foot for these seawalls here. And what they're doing now is they're building the seawalls 2 feet higher to accommodate projected sea level rise. That's going to be a repetitive proposition, I think, for a long time to come. At about $4,000, we allocate about $500,000 every year to our taxes at town meeting to rebuild 100 to 300 feet of these seawalls every year. Because the state is pretty much out of money, although every now and then they do throw in some money. The state is pretty much out of money. So we pay for it. So the options on these high-energy shorelines are actually, they're pretty limited. Dune restoration and non-structurals have a pretty limited life expectancy in these high-energy open ocean environments. So let's just go through some of the non-structural erosion control alternatives that are available. But again, most of these non-structural erosion control projects are not made to have any longevity on a high-energy shore. We're really talking about the backside, the Parker River, the Merrimack River, and the estuarine areas where these non-structural erosion control projects will work. And one of the things I'm seeing taken off along the Atlantic seaboard, you know, in the Chesapeake Bay, along Maryland, and in Florida, all of the mid-Atlantic states down in Florida are doing what they're calling living shorelines. What they're doing is basically building salt marshes. So this is what the shoreline looked like initially. There was an erosion problem here, and what you've got to do though is you've got to break up the wave energy. So what they do here in New Jersey, in North Carolina, in South Carolina, in Florida, they'll build a little rock sill here. In Florida, they're actually doing it with shells, with oyster shells. They're building little sills with oyster shells. Then they'll fill back here with compatible sediment and then basically plant it with marsh grass. And it's been incredibly successful throughout the Chesapeake, throughout Maryland, in Florida, and so forth. In Massachusetts, though, we're having and this was brought up at the Coastal Erosion Commission as well. We can't put this sill out because trading habitats is really frowned upon, you know, by certain entities. For example, you have an intertidal flat. It's shorebird habitat. It's shellfish habitat. It provides a beneficial function. So when you place a sill on there and you fill the marsh, even though the marsh is important, critically important to fisheries and everything else, you've lost the other habitat. You've lost the intertidal habitat. So the regulators in Massachusetts really are frowning on changing this habitat. But if an alternative is to build a bulkhead or a seawall back here, and you have the right to do that because your house was built before 1978, wouldn't it be much better to sort of give in a little bit, put that rock sill there and build a salt marsh rather than a hard structure? So that's something that was brought to the attention of the Coastal Erosion Commission, and we're hoping they'll consider allowing some of these sills to be constructed in some of these areas. Living shorelines have been tried here in Massachusetts on several occasions. This was on Cape Cod here. This was an eroding shoreline up here. They put down fiber rolls, coconut husk fiber rolls. There's no sand in them. They're all coconut fibers. If you took a coconut fiber, you try to break it. It's incredibly strong, and they're densely packed and wrapped. So what they did was, rather than build a bulkhead, they said, well, we'll try this living shoreline. So they did put some, they put fiber rolls in there, put some fill in, they built a salt marsh, but they put a fiber roll in front here. A fiber roll is a photo and biodegradable substance. It has a life expectancy of maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years. It depends on how much tidal inundation, how much tidal water touches it, it's its longevity. So what happened is basically the fiber roll failed after 3 years, and after it failed, the substrate started to erode away. If it were a sill, it would have kept the material there and the salt marsh would probably still be there. But they also had a problem with ducks. They came in and they ate most of the marsh grass. So, lucky them. Anyway, but there was an attempt to do that. And it looked beautiful for a number of years. It lasted about 8 years, which was pretty nice. This was another attempt at a living shoreline in Pleasant Bay, down in Orleans. Again, a fiber roll. And the point was that when the waves overtop this, it has fine-grained material. They were hoping that the fine-grained material would overtop and actually naturally fill itself, and the marsh grass would come in itself. So here it was here. There's fiber rolls here on this coastal bank. But eventually the fiber roll collapsed. It didn't catch enough sediment. So I did bring up to the commission, if we had a sill there, we'd be able to rebuild these marshes. And maybe there are certain areas that could be allowed, maybe not. If it's an important commercial or recreational shellfish area, leave it alone. Not. So it's very site-specific. Perhaps we could allow them some experiments to be tried here in Massachusetts. And this is what happened. It basically deflated, and you can see the salt marsh basically started to diminish. So we've tried these fiber rolls on a number of occasions. Fiber rolls will work in a low wave energy environment. They'll have life expectancy. They're basically a temporary measure to hold the toe of a coastal bank till the vegetation on the coastal bank takes place, and then the root structure will hold the material in place. And again, they'll last 3, maybe 5 years, a little longer if they're not inundated with water. Well, here was a fiber roll array here on the western shore of Cape Cod. We had a freak storm out of the west, 100-mile-per-hour winds out of the west over 2 tidal cycles, and it completely obliterated that. And they basically ended up building a revetment. But fiber rolls do have longevity in the right environment. Here's some of those coir rafts that you saw, that you've seen in Plum Island. The coir rafts, again, they're temporary measures. They're usually used to hold the toe of a coastal bank, again, until the vegetation takes place on a dune or on a coastal bank. But they do have a life expectancy. These lasted about 7 years before they collapsed, and all the sediment and the vegetation of above basically collapsed with it. You know, this was the cover of Erosion magazine just recently. You know, these are the envelopes here that were put in Plum Island. I came up to look at them. By the time I came up here, they were covered with, I believe they were covered with sand. And I went down here today to see if they were still there, but my understanding was they were destroyed during a subsequent storm. High energy, open ocean environment, temporary measure. But they showed you, they look pretty substantive. These are just some of the attempts that were made on these open ocean shorelines with non-structural, biodegradable, and photogradable material. Here's the remnants of the beach face dewatering system on the eastern shore of Nantucket. Well, this was interesting. They actually used the Quar envelopes, but inside they wrapped it with a non-biodegradable substance, and the Conservation Commission missed it on the plans, unfortunately. So they wrapped them up, but they covered them with sand, they vegetated it, so if a storm comes, that sediment supply is still there for the downdrift beaches. So the mitigation component is there, and that's probably the most important part of it, the mitigation, to mitigate the loss of whatever that beneficial function was. This is what I see, I think is our future. Small beach nourishment projects, either in front of private property, but particularly on public beaches. These small seasonal beach nourishment projects. Because we can't, basically the sand sources are drying up. We can't keep up with this erosion. So if it's a recreational beach and it's a seasonal recreational beach, I'm seeing a lot of communities on their public beaches come in with the veneer of sand in the early spring and enjoy the beach for the summer. And then that slowly erodes and provides a sediment source that actually wasn't there previous to the downdrift beaches. I think it's kind of a possibly a win-win situation. Large beach nourishment projects have not taken place in Massachusetts to any significant degree. We see beach nourishment projects, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Florida, massive multi-million-dollar beach nourishment projects. We don't really see them here in Massachusetts. One, because we don't have a good, adequate sand supply, and two, we have a very short season. So I don't think the cost-benefit analysis is working out for these massive multi-million-dollar projects. There were three done on the south side of the Cape. This was one of them. There's a vertical concrete wall here. There was no beach. The beach was basically right up to the seawall itself. The Woods Hole Group, consulting firm on the Cape, designed a beach nourishment project, and they got it from the navigation channel going into Hyannis Harbor. They asked the Corps of Engineers if they could widen the navigation channel outside the authorized limits and get a sand deposit there, which they were able to do. So they did build this beach. They put up 90,000 cubic yards of sand. It had about a 10-year life expectancy. After about 5 years, it still had about 65% of its sand. So these beach nourishment projects, they usually have about a 10, maybe 15-year life expectancy. So you've got to do a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether or not it is. But this was a highly successful project. But it's on Nantucket Sound. It has a very low wave environment. You're talking about up here in Plum Island, you're talking about on the South Shore, where it's a very high-energy wave environment where beach nourishment would have to be quite substantial, like a $10, $20 million nourishment project. This was a beneficial reuse of dredge material from the Cape Cod Canal's the power plant in the Cape Cod Canal. They had 60,000 cubic yards of sand that they were going to put in an offshore disposal site. It was beautiful, coarse-grained sands. So they agreed to take it and hydraulically pump it up onto the public beach in Sandwich, which was downdrift of the Cape Cod Canal jetties. So they pumped up 60,000 cubic yards of sand at a cost of about $600,000. And this is what it looked like. It was beautiful, it was beautiful sand. Here's the boardwalk. There used to be a 10-step boardwalk going down to the beach. It completely covered it. The beach nourishment project looked wonderful. But the power plant had a limited amount of time to get permits. And if you're going to do a beach nourishment project, you're going to need 2 to 3 years to get permits. They had to dredge immediately because they've got, they have a commercial facility with tugboats coming in. So they said, we have to do it immediately. We have to kind of short-circuit the permitting process. So we're going to keep all the sand above high water And because they kept it above high water, they oversteepened the deposit. If you oversteepen, if you don't do the beach nourishment project, design it at the proper slope. So you go out and you look at the natural beach, you mimic that natural slope. They had to oversteepen it to keep it above high water. Otherwise, the town would have lost the sand. They would have basically wasted it offshore. So they said, okay, do it. But because they oversteepened the beach, 10 months later, the entire 60,000 cubic yards had eroded away. But it wasn't gone. The people down in Spring Hill Beach, about 2 miles down, were delighted. They had never seen as many sandbars offshore breaking the storm waves. So they said, do it again. I think we're going to see a lot more dune restoration projects as well. You know, this was a dune, basically a sacrificial dune project that was done. This was done on Humrock Beach after the October 1991 storm. But after these storms, 2012, 2013, what we're seeing, I'm seeing these massive dune restoration projects all around the, all around the state, and they're successful. They're fairly successful. You've just got to keep in mind maintenance. You know they're going to erode, so you've got to have a resource of sand, basically a stockpile of sand, ready to go to do these nourishment projects. I had mentioned Duxbury Beach here on the South Shore, owned by the Duxbury Beach Reservation, the nonprofit. Well, we got significant damage. We got about $1 million worth of damage to our dunes on our beach as well. There's an improved roadway on the backside of the barrier that goes to 300 houses. There's only about 2 to 3 dozen people who live out there year round. But seasonally, there's 300 houses. They're in the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant evacuation zone. So we're trying to preserve this roadway. Those property owners have a right to travel along the beach in their deeds. So the Duxbury Beach Association years ago said, all right, we can't have people driving on the beach and over the dunes. Let's build this back roadway. So they built the roadway. But now we're trying to keep up with sea level rise. I told you that barrier has already migrated about a mile landward since it was formed. So what we're doing now is we're rebuilding the dunes. Just after these storms, we brought in 15,000 cubic yards of sand, 3,500 cubic yards of gravel, but we moved the road landward 40 feet because we couldn't build a dune anymore to protect the road. How ironic. So we basically moved the land 40 feet, and then we had enough room where we rebuilt the dune. So we're trying to, we're very fortunate. We don't have houses. There was a subdevelopment of 200 houses on Duxbury Beach in the I think it was the 1950s, and it was bought by an association, a nonprofit association. So they would have been in an incredibly bad situation, probably worse than what we're seeing up here in this region, because it's much lower than even Club Island or Salisbury. So we moved the road landward, we rebuilt the dune, and people who go back there now in the summertime wouldn't even notice what we did, but it cost about $1 million to do this work. We're also experimenting with cobble. I did some research on cobble. Sub-rounded cobble 4 to 6 inches. I told you about the sand, and during the seasonal cycle, you've seen it. During the winter time, during storms, the sand moves offshore, forms a sandbar, the sandbar trips the waves. Beautiful symphony. Cobble, we've found out from research, cobble does the exact opposite. Sub-rounded 4 to 6 inch cobble has a tendency to move landward during storms rather than seaward. So having read that research, we have this back roadway. You can see the problem with the back roadway. During a spring storm, it's overtopping and flooding some of these areas along the roadway. So we designed a cobble berm on the backside. We said we could go for a variance. There's 300 houses out there. It's the only road. Why don't we build a bulkhead or a little revetment there to protect this roadway? We said, no, let's try this first, and it's been successful. We've nourished it several times with 4 to 6 inch sub-rounded cobble, and it's doing a tremendously good job of protecting that backside road. So it's just basically looking for those alternatives and being able to experiment with them to see if some of these will work. So I'm going to wrap it up a little bit now and just sort of summarize kind of the dilemma that we're in. Now this is a dated report. It was done in April 2000 by the Heinz Center in Washington, D.C. called the Evaluation of Erosion Hazards. But at that time, this was April of 2000, before sea level accelerated. They found that there were about 87,000 structures within the 60-year erosion zone. This is in the year 2000, and about 1,500 structures are predicted to be lost to erosion each year, costing homeowners about $530 million. This is just a random sample nationally. So, this is a significant dilemma in terms of trying to find erosion control alternatives that may work. In Massachusetts, we got about 36,000 people live within 500 feet of the shore, and 70% of the population lives in coastal communities. So we've got waterfront people, but we've also got people enjoying the resources, the beaches, the dunes, the barrier beaches, the near-shore waters. So, you know, Marshfield, Nantasket Beach, Plum Island. You know, I've been following closely what's been happening up here. I come up here periodically. It's worth the trip. I don't have to tell you what it look. I don't have to tell you, but I see these pictures here and I get alarmed and I say, what, if these are people's private residence, primary residences, there must be something they can do. But so I come up here periodically to check out, to check out, is there some alternative that we can do up here? And I put this up here just to show, you're not alone. This is a significant issue. I don't know what the Coastal Erosion Commission is going to come up with in terms of trying to help balance that, protect natural resources, and allow people to protect their waterfront property. But I think they're scheduled to come out with a report by the end of this year. But this is this is Spring Hill Beach in the town of Sandwich. This is Humrock Beach in the town of Situate. This is the Cedarville area of southern Plymouth. You've seen the eastern shore of Nantucket. We're all in this together. There's some significant things happening. And if you, I believe this report is on the internet. USGS, the U.S. Climate Change Science Program in 2009, looked at all the barrier beaches from Long Island, New York, to the North Carolina, South Carolina border, and wrote a report on what areas they think are going to survive under different sea level rise scenarios and which ones are not. I was astounded that they actually put this in a report and actually identified the areas where they think barrier islands are actually going to disintegrate under a certain sea level rise scenario. So they started at New York, went down to the North Carolina border, and used this little chart. Now the threshold point is where the barrier beach is basically going to disintegrate under a certain sea level rise scenario. You can see the T here and the T here. So the dark orange and the red areas are the areas under the present day sea level rise scenario that we're experiencing, that they're saying within several decades may disintegrate. I don't know what that's going to do to people's property values. I think it was a service on one hand and kind of a scary proposition on another. But this report is available on the web. The National Climate Assessment just came out in 2104. National Climate Assessment came out in 2014, just recently, with their prediction. I just noticed that. I did this last night. I think I had my glass of wine with me. But in any event, this was a recent report. So this was the 2004 from the National Climate Assessment. Ocean levels are projected to rise around another 1 to 4 feet over the next century. The prediction is in about 20 years, sea level will rise about 1 foot, in about 50 years, 2 feet, and then by 100 years, maybe somewhere between 3 and 5 feet, if you believe these predictions. One of the issues for this particular area is USGS published an article just about 2 years ago that we're in a hot spot here in the New England area, from Newfoundland down to North Carolina. We're calling us the hot spot. And you'll find this also in this National Climate Assessment report. There's 3 major oceanographic currents that are circulating off the North Atlantic coast. And because of the change in the temperature of the ocean water, which has raised worldwide maybe 1 degree Fahrenheit, one of the currents is just minusculely starting to slow. But because that's starting to slow, it's affecting the other currents. Now the ocean surface in the North Atlantic area, the land over here, actually tilts down a little bit. And it tilts down because of the interaction of these oceanographic currents. Well, when they start to slow, all the ocean is trying to do is they're trying to equilibrate to a flat surface. So it's going to be a temporary acceleration. And it's exceeding the worldwide acceleration. They were suggesting that sea level rise is going to be about 3 to 4 times the worldwide rate in the North Atlantic region, only until that ocean surface re-equilibrates to a flat surface. So, I wish I had better news for you. But, only time will tell. And they were predicted this back in 2013. This is just the most recent report. So, that's all I have to say.